Yama, and welcome to the 2021 Indigenous Investigations panel for the Global Investigative Journalism Network. I hope you can all hear me fine out there. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today and pay my respects to our elders past and present. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders and Indigenous people here today joining us. My name is Suzanne Dredge. I am a Wiradjuri woman born and raised on Dharawal land. I'm coming to you today from Bundjalung country on the north coast of New South Wales. I am the supervising producer for investigations, regional and Indigenous affairs at the Australian Broadcasting Corporation's nightly current affairs flagship program, 7:30. I am so thrilled to be here with you all today in the company of my esteemed First Nations journalist colleagues joining us from all over the world. You're going to hear from three incredible investigative journalists from Australia, Canada, and the United States, who are all creating new, innovative ways to tell First Nations stories for us and by us. They'll be talking about their award-winning investigations, ranging from land theft by universities to healthcare for Indigenous children. All of these stories start with an idea and a drive to get to the bottom of it. Indigenous investigations are important, and we need more journalists and media organisations to pay attention to the systemic issues affecting Indigenous communities all over the world. From overrepresentation in the criminal justice system to land rights and treaties, there is so much work to be done, and it is up to us as investigative journalists to ensure we pay attention, understand the issues, and report on them responsibly with an understanding of cultural protocols. Because our stories matter, and it's time to take ownership over the way we approach and tell our stories. Indigenous people need to be involved in the storytelling process because we are some of the oldest living cultures in the world with thousands of years of knowledge. We are the original storytellers. Today's session will run for an hour and 15 minutes. You'll be hearing from each of the panelists, and at the end, we'll have time for questions. Please engage with the panel, ask lots of questions, and utilise this time to get the most out of the session. So that brings me to our first speaker. Our first speaker today is Trina Roach. Trina is a member of the Gloosclap First Nation and an award-winning Mi'kmaq journalist. Trina has spent most of her career with APTN, which is the Aboriginal People's TV Network. She is currently an assistant professor and Rogers Chair in journalism at the University of King's College in Nova Scotia. Trina has had a long career as a journalist covering Indigenous issues, including politics to land protection, treaty rights, and more. Trina is an award-winning journalist. She has won so many incredible awards, including in 2014, she won the prestigious Canadian Association of Journalists Award for human rights reporting for her three-part series called Outside the Circle. Thank you for joining us, Trina. We're incredibly lucky to have you today, and I'll hand over to you.
Well, Alan, thank you, Suzanne. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. I am in the process of reclaiming my language, so I always like to introduce myself in Mi'kmaq if I can. Delawisi Trina, Bemlagwe, the University of King's College, and Delaware Glooskap, the first Glooskap First Nation. I'll do my own land acknowledgement from where I'm coming to you from in Canada, the unceded and ancestral territory of the Mi'kmaq people who've lived here since time immemorial. I've worked for APTN I worked for APTN. I don't work for them anymore. Now I'm teaching journalism, but I worked for APTN for 2 decades and did stories. It's funny, Suzanne mentioned treaty rights and land rights and all of these common stories that come with colonialism and the impacts of colonialism. And I've done those stories here in my territory. And investigations, for me, have looked like, police accountability. Holding the government accountable. Suzanne mentioned the Human Rights Reporting Award. I mean, the fact that in Canada, I win an award for human rights reporting, I think is indicative of the ongoing impact of colonialism here. So there's a lot of work to do. I thought that I would start today. I was trying to decide, what to talk about. And archival research is something I'm engaged in right now. And it's something that's really important because we had, around the world, it made headlines, the 215 unmarked graves that were recovered from a residential school in Tk'emlúps in British Columbia. And that was just the start. There were more graves uncovered using ground penetrating radar throughout the summer. And so it was a traumatic time for Indigenous peoples across Canada, and, shocking, but not surprising. I think the Canadian public and I think the world was shocked, but Indigenous peoples have been telling these stories. And so now you see media stepping in and engaging in research and looking at the archival records. Because Indigenous people's stories, Indigenous voices need to have weight, and we need to legitimize those stories, whether or not there's sort of archival proof. But the colonial records really reveal an historic and ongoing, policy of assimilation, of cultural genocide, and it's all there in the records. And it becomes very, very important because there's a real life impact. Like I spent today, actually, because we're looking I'm looking at a residential school story right now. And there's a woman who's a survivor of residential schools, who was part of the 60 scoop. So after residential school, she's adopted out or fostered out. And she can't find the paperwork. And it becomes a real tangible, meaningful story for her because, she wants compensation. And she can't have that without the work. And so uncovering what happened and digging into the archives is a really important process to sort of provide the context, to understand the context, to understand what happened, and why it's so relevant today. So I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully it works. Oops. So Indigenous stories in Canada. And this is the residential schools. This was one of the pictures. APTN had taken this picture, and I think because there was the 215, and then there was over 700 graves in the Cowessess First Nation, and it was just such a shocking number. I remember watching that Facebook Live, and my heart just stuttered at that number. And so people need answers, and people, like when I ask people today, what research do you want me to do? They want the records. They want the truth. And Canada talks a lot about truth and reconciliation. You cannot have reconciliation until you have truth. And so it becomes really important. And we're the ones as journalists, as investigative journalists, we have the skill set to do these stories. And so it becomes really important. So right now I'm working with CBC. They did this story. I was not part of this story. But some of the records, there was a boy who was literally just recorded as dummy bad boy in the residential school records. I hesitate to even call them residential schools. They're institutions. Most schools don't have a graveyard. And so they took 2 months to investigate and figure out who this kid was. And what happened to him. So historical research is really key. And the archival materials that are available, so we call it Indian Affairs. Well, now I don't know. Now it has different names, but historically, the department in charge of the Indians in Canada was Indian Affairs. And there's these RG10 records, and so those are a source. And there are so many records, and they're all in what we have, the National Archives, the Library and Archives Canada. Some are held in provincial archives. So it becomes a real challenge to navigate archives. And archives are vast. So the skill set required to sort of pinpoint, sometimes it's like looking for a needle in a haystack when you're going into these archives. You have to be very specific. The archivist is your friend. I found that out. And church records. So especially for the residential school or Indian day schools, the church records are really important, but they're also really challenging because they're not always available, and you're sort of at the whim of the church or the Sisters of Charity or whoever, whichever organization or religious affiliation, to hand those over. And so that becomes really challenging. Library and Archives Canada, I mentioned. The National Truth and Reconciliation Center is another site that has a lot of archival material, sort of from Indian affairs, from church records. And then there's this whole process of sort of like cross-referencing, right? So the political record, we look at Hansard, we look at like, you're scrolling through microfilm, archived newspapers on microfilm. And I do have a story about that, because I one time was doing a doc. I like historical docs. I like exposing the history, and there's so many great stories in the history. There's always resiliency and agency for Mi'kmaq people who have, sort of survived and are still here. But Mi'kmaq people had kind of a cool role in the evolution of the game of hockey. And they used to make these hockey sticks, and they were called the Micmac sticks. And they were actually the sticks that sort of pre-NHL, the teams that became the NHL as we know it today, were using these Micmac sticks. So it was a really cool story. And there was a newspaper reference that I had heard about that was, this old elder had written like an op-ed in the 1940s into the paper talking about, this game that the Mi'kmaq played and these sticks, and it was really hard to find. And another journalist who was also working on a story had not found the story, or if not found this newspaper article. And then I found it and like fist pumped silently in the archives. And I thought, wow, that's fist pumping in the archives. I knew that I had made it. Anyways, I found the article and I did the doc, and it was really cool. And personal keepsakes. So sometimes people, whether it's Mi'kmaq people or Indigenous people or other people, sometimes have personal keepsakes. And so we do a lot of cross-referencing, but there's a lot of stuff that we can go to and look at. But mainly, we talk to people, right? The stories live today, and archival records are words on paper. You always need to talk to people. Like today, I was talking to people. What do you need me to look for? What are the stories? Like, what is relevant? If I find something, I take it to them and I say, what does this mean to you? Like, how does this resonate? And people always put things in perspective. So you can't get buried in the archives either, because the story is out in the world. But the archives certainly provide a way for us to find really key, important information. So uncovering the ongoing impacts of colonialism. I would say that archival research is investigative. I mean, sometimes what do we call investigative journalism? Holding government to account and all that stuff. And it's holding, it might seem like historical research and holding past governments, but colonialism is ongoing. We have residential schools, then we have child welfare now. We have treaty rights that are still being contested. And so all of this historical research matters today. And it's especially important, and I said in a country that buries its dark chapters of history, because Canada has a history of slavery. It has a history of assimilation and cultural genocide against its Indigenous people. And that does not get taught in mainstream education. Like, most people don't know these stories. So I did a documentary on centralization, which was a policy by Indian Affairs to move Mi'kmaq people in Nova Scotia who were living through the 1940s in pretty much fairly traditional lifeways, all over the province, in their kinship groups and living in their traditional territory still. And there were reserves, but they lived on them sometimes, and then they would still they were still mobile and moving around. And centralization was really this plan just to move the Mi'kmaq to just 2 reserves and sort of tuck them out of sight, out of mind, and put them on these reserves. And it really disrupted ties to land, ties to traditional territory, kinship ties, all of those things. And the policy failed. Mi'kmaq resisted the policy, but the damage was kind of done. And so that's important today, because the 2 communities that people were centralized to, those are the 2 communities today where we see, higher rates of crime, higher rates of poverty, all of that stuff. And so, it doesn't stay in history. So when people say, oh, just get over it, that happened in the past, it doesn't work that way. These decisions that get made in the past carry forward today. And I mean, honestly, Canada has a creation story that does distort reality, and especially for Indigenous peoples. And so this idea that what was I reading one day, and it said Indigenous peoples were swept aside as if it was some sort of gentle, like whoosh over to the side. Mi'kmaq people are still here. They resisted. There was violence, and there was assimilation, and there was abuse, and all of these things. And it's really important to recognize that. The RG10 records, I mentioned those. There are rows and rows and rows. This is Library Archives Canada, and I filmed there when I was doing the documentary on centralization. And not all of these rows here are RG10 records, but I have probably a good 4 of them. But it was literally, that's like maybe 10 to 20% of their RG10 records. The rest of them are in like another building. So this is the belly of the archives, and it's really like, this is just a little snapshot of these archives that pertain, these records that pertain to government actions against Indigenous peoples throughout colonization. And so there's a lot of stories there. They are colonial records. They're, that's always important to remember. There are sometimes voices from Indigenous people, like letters and petitions that they wrote, but for the most part, these are records of decisions made by government officials, by Indian agents. Like, so that's really important to remember. But sometimes it does paint the picture, right? You just have to make sure you go talk to Indigenous peoples about their experience of that, because that's where the story is. So we can hold Canada accountable, but we center Indigenous people in our stories. And so the power of this, so I use this because when I looked at some of these records, I was able to pull quotes. So when they moved people through centralization, they put enormous pressure on people. They promised Mi'kmaq people like jobs and housing and all of that stuff in on reserves, and then they broke all those promises, and they would burn their house behind them, so they had nothing to go back to. And so these files, there's no audio to this, but I was able to incorporate this information from these documents. So they're using their powers of persuasion. They refuse to move. They should be enfranchised, which means they lose like Indian status. They're no longer Indian. Using a section of the Indian Act. And I was able to sort of quote these like commissions, are they demolished, the houses? And the majority of them were burned. And so these records are just a way to show a snapshot of the way the government treated Mi'kmaq people at this time. And just a little note about, I'm not sure how I'm doing for time, I'll wrap it up. A note about reporting Indigenous stories responsibly. Be a storyteller, not a story taker. Work with Indigenous peoples. There's always that, I don't think it's unique to Indigenous peoples, but, with us, not about us. And we need to collaborate. These are Indigenous stories and they belong to Indigenous people. So if you're doing stories about Indigenous peoples, make sure you're doing it with them. We are investigative researchers. We're good at research. So do your research no matter where you are. Know who the Indigenous peoples are, the treaties that were signed, where you stand. Watch your language, and bias. Bias is a myth. Like a bias-free reporting is a myth. And so you need to recognize your own bias and work around that, and recognize the legitimacy of Indigenous voices, nations, laws, governance, and traditional knowledge, and recognize diversity. We're saying Indigenous a lot here because this is a global investigative conference. That always be specific in your story, like say Mi'kmaq or whatever the First Nation is, to be specific. The last slide, and these slides are there, I won't list these, but there are just some resources that might come in handy. And this slide is going to be shared. Walalio, thank you.
Thank you, Trina. That was excellent. I think archival research and data are so important when it comes to Indigenous investigations, which brings me to my next panellist, Lorena Allen. Lorena is a Gamilaroi Yuwallaroi Yuna woman from the Darwa region of far northwest New South Wales and Guardian Australia's Indigenous Affairs Editor. Lorena is an award-winning journalist. In 2018, Lorena and her team won a Walkley Award for their Deaths Inside Indigenous Deaths in Custody database. And in 2019, she won another Walkley Award for her work on The Killing Times, which is a confronting and evolving digital series. It's absolutely incredible. If you get a chance, go and check it out. The project basically tells a history of more than a century of armed conflict and resistance along the expanding colonial frontier in Australia. So please make Lorena welcome. And I can see some of you raising your hands. If you can just hold on to those questions to the end, that'd be great. Thank you. Over to you, Lorena.
Thank you, Suzanne, and Yama, everybody. I'm coming to you from Wonga land here in Sydney, in New South Wales, Australia, and I pay my respects to the elders of the Wonga clans of the Sydney Basin. And I pay my respects to my people, the Wallerai people from far northwest New South Wales, and thank them for raising me to be a journalist, to have the privilege of doing these sorts of investigations. I just wanted to echo so much of what Trina has just said about the ongoing impacts of colonisation, because this investigation I want to talk about is really a strong example of those ongoing effects of colonisation. As Suzanne mentioned, I'm going to talk about a project we started in 2018 called Deaths Inside, which tracks every known Indigenous death in custody in Australia. It began in 2018, but of course, this has a long history. And back in 1991, there was a big royal commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody in Australia that handed down 339 recommendations that were aimed at reducing the rates of people going into custody and amending police cells, prison cells. There was a raft of recommendations that were designed to stop this stream of our people going into custody where they were dying in disproportionate numbers. So in 2018, we wanted to know exactly how many Aboriginal people had been dying in prison custody since 1991, when all of these recommendations were handed down, particularly because we were reporting on these deaths and coronial investigations into these deaths that were seemingly happening in very similar circumstances. So I'm going to just share with you this project and just walk through how we did it and why we did it. So I'm hoping you can see that. This main screen it's really an explanation of what we did and why we did it. The illustration you see here is by Wiradjuri artist Charlotte Allingham, who we worked with collaboratively to design a kind of way, an imagery for the project that was trauma informed. I mean, I guess the whole project wanted to be trauma informed because we're dealing with such distressing material. And I should also say to any of our mob who are on the conference today, I'll warn you that this is some challenging content here. So we looked at every Indigenous death in custody because we discovered that nobody else was doing that. When we wanted to know how many people had died in custody, my colleague Calla Walquist started ringing around the different jurisdictions, state and territory, asking them for these stats, how many of our people were ending up in custody and dying, and they were unable to provide those figures. And that was the first flag to us that this was a serious problem, because one of the key recommendations of the Royal Commission was to maintain this information. The reason this data is so important is because you need to be able to track over time trends in incarceration in order to be able to prevent them and stop them. So the fact that the counting had stopped was of real concern to us. So, and we knew that systemic issues remained just based on our reporting of coronial investigations. We were mindful that a lot of coronial investigations were taking years to come to court. Families were given very little information about how they would be treated. The whole process was very alienating. They were made to feel like they had committed some sort of crime when in fact they were grieving the loss of their loved one who died before their time. And we also knew that imprisonment rates are rising. So that was the why. And so this is the how. When we realised that the data wasn't being kept, we figured that we should do it. And at first, we didn't realise what an enormous job that was going to be. At first, we wanted to go back to 1991 and go through every coronial report from 1991 to 2018. We realised that was beyond our capacity at that point. So we picked a 10-year period. We looked at Indigenous deaths from 2008 to 2018 in every jurisdiction. We combed through all of the publicly available reports. That was coronial investigations, media reports, wherever we could find information, including the families who'd reported that stuff to us. We went, it was all publicly available information, and we gathered it all together. Jurisdictions don't often provide that information unprompted. So when an Indigenous person dies in custody, it is up to the media to ask what happened to them and ask those questions, because that's not information they like to volunteer. So we assessed, you can see here, this is the sort of back end of the database. We assessed every person against a number of data points: their age, the age they first went into custody, the time of their coronial inquest, how long it took to be heard, whether there were medical issues that the system was aware of that they failed to act upon. Was there violence? Was that person a victim of police pursuit? Were they injured in custody? All of those data points, we had to read coronial reports very closely, our small reporting team, and then we had to check each other's work to make sure that data was absolutely correct. That took several months, about 8 months to do that in 2018. And then we created the public-facing database, and this is where we tried very hard to be trauma-informed about the way we did that. There's an opt-in screen that gives you an explanation in the context of the investigation, and a warning to people that there is some strong content inside it. So this part was, we spent a lot of time with families and their advocates, including Aboriginal Legal Services, showing them through our work to make sure that they thought it was going to be okay. Because while we thought this was an important project, the crucial thing was to do it in a way that did not compromise really significant Indigenous cultural concerns about death and dying. In many of our mobs, we don't use images or names of people after they've passed. And this is an extremely distressing content for people to view. So it was important that we did it carefully. And you can still be an investigative journalist and be trauma-informed. I think when you're working in Indigenous affairs, that is fundamental. And earning the trust of the families is fundamental. As Trina said earlier, trust is really important. When you share a person's story, they are trusting you with it. It is not your story, it's theirs, and you have to do everything you can to tell it respectfully. So this is the inside of the database. Once you click through, every one of those squares is a person who is loved and missed. Here is some information about each of those people. It's a sort of a description of what happened to them, and we were able to measure trends over time. Where you see people's names and faces, we used that with the express permission of the families. The only times we used names and images was when the families provided them, because just the idea that you would have all of these faces confronting you was we thought too much. So each square is a person. Where you can't see a person, we had Charlotte's illustrations to denote each of those people. So you can see here, she had a really difficult brief. She shared, like me, her concerns about doing this in a trauma-informed way. And I think her illustrations are really lyrical and beautiful. And I'm so grateful that we were able to use her genius in this project. So the database wasn't the beginning, it wasn't the end of the project by any stretch. We used it for ongoing reporting. So in 2018, we published with a number of news reports. We were able to demonstrate, here in the graph at the bottom, you see the dramatic difference in treatment that Indigenous people experience in custody. And so we were able to show that systemic problem that so many families were saying was the case. But I think when you're able to give it that really simple graphic treatment, it has an impact. We also worked with families to tell their stories. That top left article was published on the 30th anniversary of the Royal Commission in 2020. Families had started to unite to support each other. The Judith Foundation was set up by April Watson, the daughters of Tanya Day, who died in prison custody in Victoria. And they have been strong and really important advocates for families in this confusing coronial process. And in 2019 and 2020, we updated the database again. Because I think the thing about database projects is it's not one and done. You can't just put this out, put it out into the world. It needs, you need to give it life. You need to persist with it. I don't think we expected that we would do this, we would keep doing this, but it's been really important to be able to do that. And we, you know, it's distressing news that the number of Aboriginal people in custody has continued to rise. As I said before, every person in that database is someone who has loved and missed somebody's child, somebody who was brutalised by the system had a duty of care to that person. This is Ted and Helen Russell and their son, their only son, Eddie, and their grandson, Edward. We worked very closely with the family to tell Eddie's story. And to them, it's very important that you see them and hear what they have to say to understand their experience, because numbers on a page and graphs can be powerful. But this is the family. These are the families who are grieving and who have not received justice. So I think part of the important part of truth telling, and the media is a fundamental part of that, is to advocate for justice. Because you can, truth without justice involves people giving their stories to you, to what end? So what was important to us was that there be some form of systemic change built into this project. We're really proud that during the Black Lives Matter protests that took place last year and this year in capital cities around Australia, a lot of people were using our numbers on their protest placards, calling for systemic change, pointing out that there have been no convictions of anybody involved in deaths in custody in Australia, and that should change. The argument is that if people are held personally responsible for their actions as prison guards or police officers, then perhaps the system will improve. When the system is less likely to protect individuals, then individuals might act with best practice. The other thing I should mention about this project was that as a result of it, the federal government at the time released funding for a custodial notification service, or CNS, which is a life-saving but simple principle, which is that whenever an Aboriginal person is taken into custody, they can ring a number and they will get on the other end of the line legal and social advice immediately. It was a lifesaver in New South Wales, and it has now been rolled out around the country, which is a fantastic result. There's a long way to go. There is a long way to go. And I think when it comes to Indigenous reporting, persistence is really fundamental. I'll stop sharing this now. We are really grateful to be able to work with such committed, hardworking families who go above and beyond every single day. I feel like as a journalist, it is my job to help amplify their stories, and amplify their stories not just to... Their trauma isn't the purpose of the story. What our role is to take that story and put it at the feet of governments and officials and hold them to account. And I think that's a really important part of what we do. So Suzanne, I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Lorena. That was excellent. Like I said, I encourage you all to go and check out her work. It is absolutely incredible. And I think it will be utilised for many, many years to come. I just want to remind everybody, can you please start posting your questions into the chat? Tristan will be speaking next, and then we're going to move on to Q&A. So if you can all please start posting your questions, that would be great. So that brings me to our next panelist, who is Tristan Artone. Tristan is a member of the Kiowa tribe and editor-at-large at Grist. He's previously served as editor-in-chief at the Texas Observer and Indigenous Affairs editor at High Country News. Tristan is known for delivering high-impact investigative stories that bring about change and make people pay attention. In 2020, he led a team that included some of his colleagues in publishing a year-long investigation into American colleges and universities built on land expropriated from Native American tribes. The project was called Land Grab Universities, and he won a George Polk Award for that and many others. So welcome, Tristan. We're so pleased to have you today, and can't wait to hear what you've got to share.
Thanks for that introduction, and thank you for the invitation to be here. It's an honor to be sharing this space with such amazing reporters and hearing more about y'all's great work. I'm speaking to you from Austin, Texas, which is the easternmost edge of my tribe's historic territories. As mentioned, I'm incoming editor-at-large at Grist, and also a founder of the Indigenous Investigative Collective. And for this bit, I'm going to talk to you just briefly about 3 stories by the Indigenous Investigative Collective. And then we're going to take a slight right turn and talk to you just a little bit about Indigenous journalism, and one way in which it's different than many Western models. All the stories I'm presenting come with a little QR code. Just giving this a try, so should you want to read more after the session, you can do so. As you've heard, a lot of context, history, and lived experiences are really important to the work that we do. I'd like to show you how that is played out in the work of the IIC. I'm going to share my screen with you here. So our first story that came out was this one here called the Anti-Indigenous Handbook. It was a collaboration with the Aboriginal People's Television Network in Canada, Lorena at the Guardian Australia, High Country News in Colorado, and the Texas Observer. And the aim of the story was to highlight some of the most common ways in which anti-Indigenous organizations and sympathizers undermined or attacked Indigenous people. It's kind of a field guide, if you will, that highlights the most common ways in which anti-Indigenous sentiments basically seep into all levels of government across the world. The story actually came out of our first informal meeting, actually at GIJC in Hamburg in 2019. And thanks to support from GIJN, Indigenous journalists from around the globe came together and discussed potential ideas for stories. The Anti-Indigenous Handbook here is one that was kind of, that we realized had some common themes in all of our communities, all of us sort of facing the same similar tactics when it comes to challenging our basic human rights, and that oftentimes those attacks simply iterated in different forms depending on the country or political system. On some level, the story is relatively simple. It's 7 vignettes from our respective newsrooms that thread together military occupation, far-right extremism, systemic racism and law enforcement, land thefts, environmental racism, and the murder of Indigenous people by police. But of course, what makes this special is that the reporters involved were steeped in their beats and able to really cut past, I would say, a purely explanatory piece to one that gives some real and concrete examples of a phenomenon that has really yet to be studied in any significant way that I'm aware of. And we also believe we think it's the first global Indigenous collaboration of its kind. Hope to do more in the future. If there's others, please let me know. I'd love to check them out and read them. Our second investigation was released earlier this year, and it was titled A Broken System. It was a collaboration between Indigenous reporters at Searchlight, New Mexico, Indian Country Today, and High Country News. And the team set out with essentially a singular question in mind, and that was how many Indigenous people had died from COVID-19. At the height of the pandemic, we really noticed that journalists from across the US had reported on high COVID-19 mortality rates on the Navajo Nation. But that coverage primarily focused on communities within the Navajo Nation's borders. And IIC journalists knew that to get a more accurate picture of how the pandemic had affected Navajo citizens, they would have to look beyond those borders at communities and towns like adjacent to the reservation where thousands of Navajo citizens live. And the goal was to gather death certificates and examine names, locations, and other data to identify any Navajo people who may have died of COVID-19 but had not been counted in statistics either from the Navajo Nation or other government agencies, possibly due to place of residence issues or documentation errors. But after filing public records requests in the 4 states that straddle the Navajo Nation, all of them were denied by agencies citing privacy concerns. And to put this into context, there are 55 Indigenous nations in those 4 states with significantly large populations and territories. And with all 4 states denying access to public records, we knew the situation actually had nationwide implications. Basically, if we couldn't get records to examine COVID-19's impact in this region, it would be impossible to extrapolate any meaningful information that could provide a general perspective on how the pandemic affected 576 nations across the US. Basically, that story would not have been possible without Indigenous reporters familiar with the area, as well as being familiar with national coverage of the region, to really know where the holes were and how to advance the reporting. Our most recent story, which was released last week with the Texas Observer and NBC News, we investigated claims that a group in Texas that says it's a tribe may actually be fraudulent. And the story came to our attention because the organization in question, called the Mount Tabor Indian Community, convinced the city of Grapevine, which is a town just outside of Dallas, to erect a statue of a man that they say led their tribe in the 1800s. And in this image, you can see the statue of this man. But through the course of our reporting, we found that historians actually say that this person never existed. As well, one of the founders of the tribe had previously founded at least one fake tribe in the state of Missouri. That tribe, called the Northern Cherokee Nation, has been denounced as a fraudulent tribe by the actual Cherokee Nation, and was investigated by the LA Times in 2019. Reporters there found that members of the Northern Cherokee Nation had received more than $260 million in government contracts meant for minority business owners. What our reporting found was that Mount Tabor Indian Community in Texas appears to be following the same playbook to potentially take advantage of benefits meant for Indigenous communities. Graham Lee Brewer, the co-author on the story, who's at NBC, is a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. And I think what makes this story really special is that Brewer took one look at Mount Tabor's history and knew that something was off, really setting in motion this investigation. It took to the point of lived experience and context. Brewer saw something that I couldn't see by looking at the history of this organization, and saw something that non-Indigenous reporters couldn't see either. And while it led us to many of the places that investigative reporters had already tread, I think it provides another example of how to do investigative work in Indigenous communities through means that rely on history and context. Brewer didn't need to find the story by crunching data. He found the story because he knows his history, and he could leverage that knowledge to really create a stellar investigation. I really recommend you take a look at this report. So these are examples of stories by Indigenous people and for Indigenous people. And for outlets that want to get in on this kind of work, I find that therein kind of lies the rub. There's a keen interest in doing this reporting, but almost no capacity to handle it ethically or for the benefit of Indigenous readers, at least in mainstream newsrooms. To be sort of US-centric for a moment and talk about sort of traditions of journalism here in the US. In the United States, the First Amendment protects journalists. So, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. Here in the US, the profession is just so embedded in American culture that it really thinks of itself as an unofficial branch of government. This idea of the fourth estate, independent of the executive office, judiciary, Congress, but engaged in the business of checks and balances on power. And what I think separates Indigenous journalism from other forms is its reason for existing and the place that it holds outside of and often in opposition to institutions that the mainstream journalists are tied to. When we think of these founding documents here for the United States, these documents explicitly degrade, erase, or exclude Indigenous people. And the idea that I think working for American democracy is pretty antithetical to our existence. The system of American democracy has been built entirely on stolen land obtained through the genocide of Indigenous people. And this is, I think, what makes Indigenous journalism fundamentally different. It works to support ideas of sovereignty and self-determination. And those ideas are at odds at almost all times with economic and government structures and goals. But you have to keep this in mind when working in Indigenous communities. And I think it should lead to questions about your coverage if you're a newsroom that's going to get into reporting in Indigenous communities. Are you producing work for us, or are you producing work about us? Personally, for the last decade, I've been asked to train non-Indigenous journalists on how to best cover Indian country here in the US. And year after year, I meet new reporters, I visit new organizations, and I present on best practices and tips and tricks. But over the same time period, I've also seen dozens of Indigenous reporters unable to land work in major newsrooms or struggle to survive as freelancers, despite a skill set that has been in incredibly high demand over the last 2 years. And the usual excuse that I hear from newsrooms is that these reporters don't have enough experience or their writing skills are lacking. And in other words, what I'm hearing is that newsrooms feel that non-Indigenous reporters can be trained to cover Indigenous affairs, while Indigenous reporters cannot be trained to write. And this is a really serious problem with our profession, and I think one that we don't have time to explore fully in this panel, but one that we should really be thinking about a lot more in depth. The presentations you've heard in this panel tonight speak to the unique qualities that Indigenous reporters and editors bring to your newsrooms and highlight the kind of stories that you want to be telling, I assume. But frankly, there is no ethical investigative reporting in Indigenous communities without an Indigenous person writing, reporting, photographing, or editing that story. I liken it to having an all-male newsroom working an investigation on women's health, or an outlet with no Spanish speakers covering the US-Mexico border. Obviously, Trina and Lorena have provided some really solid tips. So I'll just leave you with one rule, and that is that you can't report in Indigenous communities if you don't have Indigenous representation in your newsrooms. To report accurately and ethically in Indigenous communities, you have to hire, or collaborate with an Indigenous person. That means partnering with an Indigenous outlet, hiring an Indigenous reporter, editor, or photographer, and making sure that your organization has the capacity to actually support that person. I caution you all to remember that all of us talk to each other. Like if you try to hire us on at the end of the process to sort of validate your work, like we all hear about it. If you want to hire us for, obscenely small amounts of money, people hear about it. We're reporters. If you say racist things to us or treat us as subhuman, like people hear about it and we know. And I think it's also important to remember that Indigenous people and communities are not monolithic. I can't do what Trina or Lorena or Suzanne do when they're reporting in their territories or territories adjacent. All three of us may be better suited to report in other Indigenous communities because of our backgrounds and lived experiences. But, frankly, if you're just kind of trying to, need to throw a brown person at a story, then, you should really step back and ask some serious questions about what you're truly hoping to accomplish. So yeah, please screenshot this, write it down, embroider it on a pillow. Like I've done. It's unethical to be doing this without someone from the affected community as part of your team. And I'll just say that journalism excellence really has to be part of everything your organization does, not just some parts. And that really includes your coverage of Indigenous communities. So that's what I have to say for the moment. And again, thanks for the invitation and for sharing this space.
Thank you so much, Tristan. I think you raised a lot of important topics there, and we could talk for hours about how best to support Indigenous journalists in newsrooms. So that brings us to our first question. Don't forget to send them through on the chat. We have about 23 minutes for questions, so we'll try and stick to time today. This is a question that is to all of the panelists. We might start with you, Trina. Is demoralization an issue that you face in your work? How do you push past the lack of change and progress on government and law enforcement levels to continue to investigate, research, and report to bring this important information to light? Does one fuel the other, so to speak? Trina, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I it's funny because I have done some stories on like racism and policing. And my story didn't end racism and policing, shockingly. It's still there. So, I don't go with stories with the goal of, I don't put that on my shoulders, right? I don't expect to create some change. I sort of, if I'm raising awareness of an issue, if I'm exposing an issue, and actually, Tristan, I think because you did the that investigative, the anti-Indigenous, that article, Brittany Geo contributed the RCMP, like the racism within RCMP to that. And that was some of the work that I had done sort of before that. So sometimes these stories, we just pick these threads up again and again and again. And I mean, that's just what we do. It does get frustrating sometimes. Like I circle back around on stories and I'm like, well, we're still here. I mean, when I started at APTN, I was doing stories about racism against like Mi'kmaq who were asserting treaty rights in the lobster fishery. We had won a Supreme Court of Canada decision that upheld treaty rights, went out fishing. There's all this backlash. It was chaos on the water and all kinds of stuff happening. And, 22 years later, I'm still covering that story. Because some stuff has changed, but as soon as Mi'kmaq assert rights, there they are again. And the Canadian government and the RCMP are not implementing or handling these treaty rights very well. And there's racism. So sometimes, yeah, it gets a little frustrating. But I think, I hope that when we circle forward, when we come around the circle, I just hope that like I'm a little bit further ahead. But I don't put it on my shoulder, like on my shoulders to foster change. But I'm certainly determined to keep uncovering it every time I see it. So I don't know if that helped.
It did. Lorena, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I was thinking, listening to what Trina had to say, how much that describes the work that I've done since I was a cadet. You know, one of my first jobs was to go out and cover a hearing of the Royal Commission into black deaths in custody in Australia in this single engine plane out to Wonga, which is, you know, where all my family are from, to cover the case of a death in custody. And for 30 years down the track, to still be writing these stories is profoundly depressing. And it makes me angry that I'm still doing this work. But I then look into our communities and I see that they are still doing this work. The Aboriginal legal services still turn up every day to defend our people. They're still fighting for systemic change. And so, you know, I feel like I have a skill set that can contribute, and that's why I do it. I also think it's an expectation our communities have that we will continue to tell the stories that they want told. And this is a really major thing for us. You know, incarceration and custodial system in Australia is one of the biggest issues that we face. So yeah, it can be really demoralising, but that doesn't mean we stop doing it. I mean, we don't have the option of stopping doing it.
I agree with everything said. I don't feel like I have an option. I feel like I just do it.
Yeah, absolutely. Which can be challenging and quite difficult for us as First Nations journalists, continually reporting on these issues, but they are important and that's what drives us. Our next question, regarding not wanting simply truth without justice, could you please talk about what ideally justice might look like? Would it be more incarceration, or a families or communities healing or reparations? How would you point to justice as a journalist? Tristan, we'll start with you.
You know, it's different situation to situation, but I think that the thing that is a recurring theme in all of the work that I've done over the years has been that justice doesn't exist within sort of a vacuum or within the political or governmental systems that exist. I think that what justice really looks like is sort of taking a couple of steps back and thinking about you know, what justice systems should be in the territories and lands of the United States. Frankly, being you know, honoring treaty rights or returning land to rightful owners. I mean, I tend to remind U.S. audiences all the time that there is no contract for or treaty for the state of Arizona that's taken through warfare. It's occupied territory. So if we want to talk about justice, we actually need to be taking a number of steps back to think about what justice systems should be handling these situations and bringing those attentions, I think, to readers.
Lorena, do you have anything to add?
I would say, I mean, when you look at the historical experience of First Nations people in Australia, justice means exactly what Tristan just said. It's a transfer of land, a recognition of prior ownership, and that means the return of lands without strings. These sound like very pie in the sky things, but they are fundamental to the provision of justice. I think in a media context, justice means not just telling a story because it's a powerful story or it's an emotional story. That comes with responsibilities, and it comes with an expectation that the story will you have to be aware of not exploiting people. And I think it comes back to what Tristan said at the end of his talk about if you don't have Indigenous involvement in the coverage that you're creating, then you have ethical problems. I couldn't underline that any more strongly. It's exactly right. So in a media sense, justice is about collaboration, the primacy of Indigenous people in the storytelling, and the notion of the non-Indigenous journalist stepping aside. Like, it's not your story. You have been trusted with something, and you have to tell it properly. And if that means you're not the person who tells it, you're the person who provides resources and skills to the Indigenous journalist to tell it, then that's the way to go. That's a more that's a better way of doing it.
Trina, did you have anything to add?
Not a whole lot, because I think that they both, Lorena and Tristan, spoke and gave great answers. I think that from my perspective, sometimes it is about informing the narrative, and so when we're looking at justice and we're looking at even just the recognition of sovereignty. It is 2021. Like I'm on, Mi'kmaq, like unceded land. And it's never been surrendered by any treaties. But it doesn't mean Mi'kmaq people just want to like kick everyone out. We can only, we live in now, right? So what does that look like? Well, it looks like a recognition of sovereignty, and it looks like a recognition. And our prime minister loves to say nation to nation, but that means something. And so to me, for what I would hope is that we hold him to that and say, well, you can't say those words have meaning. And so always that narrative and making sure that, and I think that that's where journalism really can come into play, because you can give weight and validity and legitimacy to the Indigenous experts in your story. And let those voices, we are a platform for people, and we can be an important platform for Indigenous voices who are calling for justice. And I have to say, like, and you said it too, Lorena, like people are showing up, Indigenous people are showing up all the time and fighting. And so we can't say, well, I'm tired of the story, I'm not going to do it anymore. Like Idle No More, missing and murdered Indigenous women, like those stories are in the headlines, like missing and murdered Indigenous women. Those stories are in the headlines because Indigenous people put them there. And so, and that, that's changing the narrative, right? And again, it's agency and resiliency. So I don't know if that answered the question either, but
no, absolutely.
I always lose my thread.
That was really good advice, Trina. Tristan, I'm going to ask you this one. What can non-First Nations journalists do to support their First Nations colleagues in the newsroom? What could I do that would matter most to you? This is something we touched on earlier.
Yeah, I mean, one, it's advocating for the hiring of folks. It's stepping in and being a mentor. Those are the easy ones. If you're an editor, it's actually listening to your reporter. The number of Indigenous reporters that I talk to who tell me that their editor will dismiss their ideas or the reporting because it doesn't fit in with their sort of stereotypical notions of the story they should be doing is really off the charts, and I think really, really frightening to hear that editors would kind of take that approach. So, I mean, I think that it's a holistic sort of approach that you have to take if you're going to bring Indigenous people into your newsroom, and making sure that they are supported at every single level. From story ideas to actual editing and reporting, because again, you're bringing in people who have skill sets that you don't have. It's the same reason why I hire a reporter who knows finance. I don't know anything about finance, so I find somebody who knows about it. And when they tell me that this is a story I should be paying attention to, I don't tell them like that's not true. I think it's something else, because that undermines their knowledge and the things that they can do well. I think there is a holistic sort of approach that people have to take. But I think the biggest one is actually listening to and believing the Indigenous reporters you have in your newsroom, because it's not really happening, I think, at the moment. I think it's changing a little bit in the US, but at a snail's pace. And that can change a lot more quickly if you've got an environment where people feel like they're heard.
I think I said this at the panel. I have said this repeatedly. And I think when we were actually in person in Houston at this panel, I said, like, just know where you stand, right? Know where you're reporting from. I think it's just basic, 101. Like if I show up and if I get a job somewhere, I'm going to do the research to figure out the politics, the politicians, who I'm going to go to, what are the organizations. You do all that work, right? Like, who's the mayor? Who's the counselor who says the best stuff? You do all that work. You have to do other work. You have to know the treaties. You have to know the First Nations that are nearby. You have to know the history and the context and who to go to for those communities. And you need to do that before there's a crisis, before you're reporting on a big breaking story. And again, like I talked about the fishing, because that was one of the, like, I find like that was a controversial story. So it's hard to screw up like a powwow story. I mean, it's possible, but like those softer stories, you can kind of get them. But when there's conflict, and when corporate or government interests butt up against Indigenous interests, and for here, like when Mi'kmaq go fishing, lobster's lucrative. There's money at stake. And so, all of a sudden, that's where you see the reporting fall apart, because there's a bias that the Canadian government and their laws and their rules are legitimate, and not the Mi'kmaq rules and laws, because they're regulating themselves fishing. And so there's your understanding when you show up in a chaotic situation is shaped by the way you see the world, which can be quite different maybe than an Indigenous understanding. And so you can't be Googling treaty rights on the way to the protest or on the way to the story. Like, you have to have done that work beforehand. So that would be my advice, is do the work beforehand.
Oh, yeah, and I would say don't ask your Indigenous colleagues to do be Google for you. That is one of the things that really alienates Indigenous people in a newsroom, especially where there's only a couple of you. I'm not Google. There's Google on your screen. Don't see us as, this is a list of don'ts. Don't see us as an open contact book as well. A lot of the people that we deal with us in after a long experience of trust, and you wouldn't ask another journo to give you their special contacts, so don't ask us. We don't telepathically communicate with other Indigenous people. We don't know everything there is to know. So those are the things you can do. Don't assume that we are there to help you in a newsroom. Perhaps it's the other way around. So I think to answer the question in a really basic way is to go and advocate to get some Indigenous colleagues. The work of forcing newsrooms to become more diverse always seems to fall to First Nations and people of colour in the newsroom. We need allies in that struggle. So volunteer, get involved, use your skills around that stuff, and then advocate for a culturally safe workplace. And if you don't know what that means, go and read up, get informed about what that looks like, and then start advocating for that in your workplace. Those are the few things I would say.
That's great. I would just add to that, I think it's really important that Indigenous journalists aren't seen as ticking a box or only there because there's a certain KPI. We are there because we are talented, we are smart, we are good at what we do. And it's also really important to have pay equality and career progression. It's not okay to leave the Indigenous journalist in the same position for 7 years and they don't progress. It's not okay to use the Indigenous journalist for their culture and their contacts and then hand it over to somebody else to go and do the story. We have to be involved in that process. We don't have long, so we do have a question from Ben Balua, who's from the Island Sun newspaper in the Solomon Islands. So how can I, as a journalist, approach diverse culture and traditional practices when reporting on sensitive issues? In addition to that, what are the necessary requirements and expertise to establish an Indigenous team of journalists to uncover unfair treatment of Indigenous people? He goes on to say there are issues of national identity in Solomon Islands. The country is still divided by ethnic identities and differences. Not all see themselves as Solomon Islanders, and few percentage of the country's citizens still see themselves belonging to other ethnic groups. So Tristan, why don't we start to you, because that's exactly what you're doing at the moment, is building a really strong team of Indigenous journalists.
Sure. I mean, I guess to the first question about approaching diverse culture and traditional practices, I mean, I think I probably need a little bit more information on that, mainly because I sort of have a general rule that we don't report on traditional practices or traditions of any sort necessarily. Typically, that typically falls into anthropology, and I just don't see that like reporting on a practice that somebody does is as news typically. So, but I don't know if that's what he's getting at. So I don't want to, Ben, I don't want to belittle your question here. I just don't have enough information to say exactly how to approach that. But generally, I stay away. Like people's traditions are their own business, so I don't treat that as news. I don't think it's ever shown up in any of my stories. As for building a team, what I think the thing that we've had to do in the past is really make sure that we're providing the support that's necessary for Indigenous affairs reporters. Is that I have specific kind of stories that I like to go after and that I'd like my staff to be going after, and that's finding the people who that may not have the experience, as I mentioned earlier, but have the talent. And I think that it's really making sure that you're providing the support for people who have the goal and drive to do this thing. I think most of the really great Indigenous reporters that I run into are usually folks, even like myself, that have been supported by people who believed in what we could do. That has not been an industry thing. That has been persons and individuals who have stepped in and done this. I owe my career to a lot of people who decided that they wanted to invest time in it. And I try to do the same with younger reporters as well. If there's any young Native reporters out there, you want some help, hit me up. We will talk anytime, day or night. Let me know. I'm here to help in any way I can, because we need as many Indigenous reporters as possible. But I guess the short answer is that you've got to support folks. You've got to train them. If there are folks out there that you're trying to get, you need to offer them a competitive wage or reason to join your team, for instance. But it's the same as building an investigative team, right? It's not all that different from building an Indigenous team or an Indigenous affairs team. And it's finding the folks that can kind of do that work really well. I'll just add, for instance, our team at High Country News was a pretty solid mix of Indigenous and non-Indigenous reporters. But Anna Smith, who's still a reporter with High Country News, she's a non-Indigenous reporter who does, I think, some of the best Indigenous affairs reporting in the country, because she spends so much time thinking about this beat and thinking about the stories that come out of it. She also knows when to step back and not be a part of something. So she's really, really good at making sure that her personal time is spent reading up on what people are writing about, books, watching movies, going immersing herself in Indigenous communities to make sure that she knows what people are talking about, and again, knowing when not to talk about something. And I think that's something that can be done, but it takes a lot of time. So buckle in for the long haul, I would say, and know that when you get there, you're going to produce some really amazing stuff.
So it looks like our session is almost finished. We can go for a few more minutes, but it will stop at the 10-minute mark. So I'm going to ask one question that I'm really curious to know for the three of you. How do you approach an Indigenous investigation? Where do you start? Where do you come up with the idea? And how do you execute it? What's in your toolkit? Trina, why don't we start with you?
People. And I think I sort of said it in the when my presentation, but because I love research and I can get kind of lost in it. But I've realized that if you don't pick up the phone and start calling people, or you don't go into community, none of it, people will say, oh, that doesn't matter. This is what you need to pay attention to. They immediately make sense of things. So my big thing is do the research. So you know the information, but I never wait too long to start talking to people. And honestly, when I was reporting, especially daily, because I started doing investigates, which we had longer time to do a story for APTN Investigates, but daily reporting, literally one story led to another story, led to another story, led to another story, right? You're in there in the community, you're talking to people. Yeah, you're focused on this today, but meanwhile, you're like, okay, I'm going to follow up on that. And then that's your next story. Like, people just lead you from one story to the next. The more stories you do, the more stories you have to do in the future. And so you just need to start talking to people. And then process, yeah, I don't know. Like, I mean, it's like, I worked in TV, so it's a lot of lining up shoots and filming. And it's finding those voices who can really, people who are living the story and who can talk about it and who can tell it. And my tip, because I'll just say this now, but one of my tips, and it's one of my pet peeves, is it's unrelated to my own investigations, but it's just a tip because someone was talking about newsrooms, is maybe don't silo Indigenous reporters, but also don't silo Indigenous people, because Indigenous people you only ever hear them when they're talking about Indigenous issues, right? I don't even say Indigenous issues anymore because it always makes it seem like Indigenous stories are problematic. Now we're going to talk about Indigenous issues, and they're just Indigenous stories. But Indigenous peoples, like Mi'kmaq people, are healthcare workers, and their kids go to school and they have all kinds of opinions about regular stuff. But you never hear Mi'kmaq voices unless it's a story about Mi'kmaq issues. And so, just representation in everyday stories. That was my tip.
Lorena, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I was just trying to unmute myself. Yes, I guess each investigation is different depending on the story and the nature of the story, but people is absolutely the first port of call. I mean, in a kind of mainstream investigation, you might put in a bunch of FOIs and fight to get them back, and you might find a story that way. In Indigenous affairs, that's not always the case. Sometimes it's about, well, most of the time it's about people, your own instincts, as Tristan referred to before. You kind of know when something's not right, and talking to people in your family or your community that something's not right, and you can apply your skills to that, asking questions, digging around, going back into the history of something. But other investigations come from people trusting you with their story. So I think one quick example for us was the Juukan Gorge inquiry investigation into Rio Tinto blowing up Juukan Gorge. A number of people came to us after we first reported that story and said, hey, this is happening to us too. And I noticed from hearing people talk about native title that this was and heritage issues all my life, really, I knew that this was a problem. So when those people came to us and told us that they were having a very similar situation with another big mining company, that was when we knew we had a really big story and that it was a systemic thing. And then we just used those usual journalistic skills of kind of picking at the edges of the story, not giving up, exploring those important leads and talking to the right people about getting expert advice, as well as putting companies on notice. So yeah, I would say that investigations take different, and they will look different depending on the nature of the project. So a data project will look different to a project that's telling the stories of people in the justice system, say.
Well said, Lorena. Tristan, do you have anything to add?
No, I agree. It's talking to people and circulating and, hearing things that pique your interest, and you're like, what's that about? I mean, that's like the entire job, right? It's just being like, what's going on with that? I'm going to check it out. Like, that's what I like about it. But I don't know, maybe Suzanne, you want to take it?
Yeah. Look, I approach every investigation with a timeline and do a historic newspaper search. That's the first thing I do. And I develop a very long list of contacts, and I call hundreds of people. I do as much research as I can to understand the topic in both sides. And, use open source material, speaking to people, documents, FOIs, court documents. It depends what the story is and what you're investigating. But, all of those things. And quite often you can work on a story for weeks and it falls over. But there is strength in being able to call it and say, okay, I need to shelve this right now, but I'm going to come back to it because I know there's something there. And it's about, that timeline helps you understand and see where the systemic issues are. But I think that's about it for us today. Thank you so much, Trina, Tristan, and Lorena. That was excellent. Thank you to GIJC for hosting this today. Please find us on Twitter. You should have access to our emails. Reach out to us anytime you want to have a yarn and continue this conversation, because it's important work, and can't wait to see what the three of you continue to do moving forward. Thank you.